So, hello all, welcome to Baji Rao IAS Academy, previous year's questions analysis. So, today we have set of questions, and the first question that we are starting today is net zero emissions. So, what exactly net zero? So, the question has been asking here is what is net zero and why it is important? India's net zero commitments must be backed by credible actions. Now, because of increasing climate change and climate change related disasters, now most of the countries have been emphasizing on net zero emissions. So net zero emissions would further reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and would reduce the climate change and its associated negative impacts. Now in this context, we need to write first what is net zero, and secondly why it is important, not just for India but also for the entire world. So why net zero, achieving net zero status is important. And the second part of the question is India's net zero commitments must be backed by credible actions. So what credible actions India could undertake to achieve net zero emissions, we will be discussing. So first and foremost, please understand what exactly net zero means. See, net zero means committing to, for example, in a particular year, one particular country has been emitting 1 billion ton of greenhouse gases. So the very same amount of emissions have to be balanced with taking the equivalent amount of greenhouse gases from the air. So, for example, creating additional forest cover or carbon sequestration methods. So through those methods, we can take away the same amount of emissions. So that also includes renewable energy projects. So whatever amount of greenhouse gases we have been emitting in a particular year, that should be balanced with the taking away the amount of carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this is how the net zero has been defined. So here one important aspect you need to remember is balancing. Okay, balancing the total emissions with taking the equivalent amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Now in the year 2015, around 150 countries have committed to limit the global warming. So we all know that climate change is becoming a very key concern for the entire world. Now, all the countries have committed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so limiting temperature requires reducing the greenhouse gas emissions so that temperature will not increase above 2 degrees Celsius. So, however, the world has been focusing on reducing emissions above 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So therefore, in fact, in order to achieve these targets, few countries like United Kingdom, New Zealand, and France, so they already provided for the proper legislative framework to achieve their respective net zero targets. Okay, so if a country does not have a legislative framework, there's no guarantee, there's no concerted action from that particular country to achieve net zero target. However, countries like UK, New Zealand, and France have already announced the legislative framework to achieve net zero emission by 2050. So, in fact, all the countries, the Western developed countries, and even several developing countries like China have already announced their net zero targets. For example, majority of the Western developed countries have announced net zero target by 2050. However, China has announced net zero by 2060. So all those countries have been announcing net zero targets, and they are also putting in right actions to achieve net zero targets. So this has resulted in increased pressure on India. So therefore, India also, as part of the Panchamrit commitments, has announced net zero emission target by 2070. So Indian economy will become a net zero by 2070, and this is part of Panchamrit. Okay, so in this context, India has also committed to reducing global temperature by 1.5 degree Celsius if possible, but it should not increase 2 degrees Celsius by the of the pre-industrial levels. Okay, so because the COP21 summit, that is Paris summit. So the Paris summit has announced that the global temperatures will not increase 2 degrees Celsius because that would be like a tipping point. So the damage or the disaster that we cannot recover because of the climate change, and this is the target. In fact, India says that future net zero promises are hollow. So why India says that the announced net zero targets by several developed countries are hollow? Because they are not taking actions at par with their commitments. That is the one major challenge, and they are also not providing finance and technology transfer to the developing countries. This is another major challenges. And since they are not delivering on their already made promises, India has been very critical of the targets which are being announced by these developed countries. So, in fact, India has also announced that these developed countries have, high per capita emissions compared to India. So, in fact, India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, no doubt about that. But in fact, India is the most populous country, so therefore the per capita emissions are lower compared to even China and other developed countries. So, India has been arguing that since we have the more less per capita emissions, so India should be given greater flexibility in achieving net zero targets. In fact, the common but differentiated responsibilities and also intended nationally determined contributions should be different for India. Now, in this context, what are the net zero targets India has already announced? So India has announced to meet the net zero target by the year 2070. So India has taken up several policies to achieve this goal. So in fact, India requires around 11 lakh crore to meet the climate goals, to invest in infrastructure so that the target of achieving net zero by 2070 can be met. So, however, the major focus of India should be on adaptation, loss, and damage. So, in fact, COP27 has also created loss and damage fund. So, in this context, adaptation, mitigation, loss, and damage has to be given a major focus. So, apart from that, recently India has also started national hydrogen mission. So, in this context, hydrogen is unlikely to deliver in the short term due to prohibitive cost. So, what does this mean? So, in fact, hydrogen is a potential and a promising greenhouse gas, promising renewable energy resources. So, however, the problem with the hydrogen energy is that still we do not have adequate technology with respect to hydrogen. Now, okay, so the private sector has also been not investing heavily in the hydrogen energy generation because it is capital intensive, and the benefits of investing in green hydrogen also long term. So apart from that, so green hydrogen, in order to produce a green hydrogen, we require fossil fuels. So energy required, and that energy is being produced from the fossil fuels. So because of all these costs which are being involved in production of green hydrogen, it is unlikely to benefit within a short span of time. So, however, these are overcomings. These challenges can overcome with emergency like measures to encourage production with respect to hydrogen energy. So in fact, what are the major industries which have been contributing to higher emissions of greenhouse gases? They are steel, cement, and concrete industries, and they should be given adequate focus. So major attempt to decarbonize the Indian economy should come from these industries. Okay, so they play a very crucial role in decarbonization of Indian economy and achieving the net zero targets by 2070. Now, in this respect, what are the measures, what are the policies which were adopted by India to achieve the net zero status? So, in fact, during the Conference of Parties 27th Conference of Parties COP27, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting. So in COP27, India announced a long-term strategy. Okay, so the long-term strategy, which is specifically focused on achieving net zero. Okay, so the long-term strategy aimed at achieving the net zero strategy and also low emissions pathway. Okay, to make or to become carbon neutral by 2070. So India has launched National Hydrogen Mission in the year 2021, and the National Hydrogen Mission aims at making India a green hydrogen hub. So as I have already told you that green hydrogen is a promising renewable energy resource. So therefore, National Hydrogen Mission over a period of time develop necessary infrastructure for transfer, storage and production of green hydrogen, and that is the essence of replacing the fossil fuel based energy systems with the renewable energy ecosystem. So therefore, it is also very important to achieve Panchamrut commitments which are being announced as part of the COP27 Glasgow summit by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So in fact, we are also aimed at enhancing our existing nuclear energy capacity. So in fact, if you look at India's overall energy mix or overall energy basket, the total energy which is being produced from nuclear power plants is very low, it's very less. However, by the year 2030, we are aimed at increasing our nuclear energy by at least threefold. So in fact, there are several nuclear power plants like Jaitapur, Kovada in Andhra Pradesh. So these nuclear power plants will further enhance the nuclear energy production. So in fact, we already achieved 10% of ethanol blending in petrol by the year 2020 itself. However, we have been trying to achieve 20% of ethanol blending in petrol by the year 2025. So this will significantly reduce India's dependence on import of fossil fuels and fossil fuel based energy systems. So apart from that, we also have been focusing on maximizing the total electronic fleet in the transportation sector, because so if you know that transportation sector is one of the major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and other major pollutants. Now cities like Delhi have been suffering with huge amounts of pollution. So because vehicular emissions releases carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and also particulate matter 2.5 and particulate matter 10. So therefore, we have been focusing on maximizing the total electronic fleet in the transportation sector, and that is also one way of reducing emissions and achieving our net zero targets. So in fact, we have been focusing or we have been making concerted efforts to gradually or rapidly increase finance. Okay, how we are planning to finance these net zero emission policies and the initiatives is financial transfer from the developed countries. Now developed countries have committed to provide at least $100 billion of assistance to these developing countries for capacity building, adaptation and mitigation of climate change related disasters. So therefore, India has been a vocal advocate of financial assistance from the developed countries to the developing countries so that they can be adequately equipped to deal with these challenges. In fact, the long-term strategy of India is actually aiming at keeping global temperatures well below the 2 degrees Celsius. Now, in fact, the COP21 climate summit actually aimed at reducing the global temperatures by 2 degrees Celsius. However, the major focus, so if possible, we aim at reducing it by around 1.5 degree Celsius. Okay, so that is how we can protect the world from the negative impacts of climate change. So, in this context, we need to understand the 5 goals which were mentioned by India during the Glasgow summit. So, what are those goals? Because these are very important and these are India's nationally determined contributions. Okay, so in fact, there were questions also on this particular commitments. So firstly, India will increase non-fossil fuel energy capacity by 500 gigawatt by the year 2030. So India will achieve, total energy generation at around 500 gigawatt of renewable energy generation by 2030. So apart from that, 50% of its energy requirements are met by renewable energy by the year 2030. So for example, through solar, wind, and also other bioenergy ecosystems can be used in around 50% of a total energy requirements. So in fact, if we're thinking about non-fossil fuel energy, so that includes renewable energy and also the ethanol and first generation, second generation, third generation fuels, and also nuclear energy. So all these factors they consist together 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel energy, and also 50% of its energy requirements will be met from the renewable energy resources. So the third commitment promise that was announced include India will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by at least 1 billion tons from now to 2030. So this is the third commitment. So carbon emissions will be reduced over a period of time. For example, introducing electronic vehicles, so electric vehicles into the transportation, and focusing on inland waterways and focusing on railways. In fact, we are rapidly electrifying all these railway lines. So that is also another way of reducing the carbon emissions. So what is the target? We will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by at least 1 billion tons now from to 2030. So the fourth commitment that is being announced by India is the total carbon intensity of its economy, for example, transportation, industry, agriculture. So everything together, we will reduce the carbon intensity of our economy by around 45%. So earlier, India announced it reducing 35% of the carbon intensity of our economy. But recently, India has further increased its contribution, its commitment to 45%. So last goal is achieving net zero by the year 2070. So if you look at on the right side, there are other countries, for example, China, which has already announced net zero target by the year 2060. Okay, so in fact, United States also, it has pledged that it would reach net zero by the year 2050. So in fact, USA has also formulated a domestic legislation to spend at least 555 billion US dollars to boost renewable power and also electric vehicles in US. So take the opportunity to understand what is net zero. So here also, so net zero refers to a balance where, for example, the emissions of greenhouse gases, whatever emissions of greenhouse gases we have, will be offset by the same amount of greenhouse gases through absorption. Okay, so this is what the net zero. Now, in fact, why net zero has been increasingly emphasized in recent times is because experts have seen that net zero targets are very critical measure. They are very critical to successfully tackle climate change and also the negative consequences of climate change. Okay, so this is what is net zero and India's 5 pledges, Panchamrit commitments, and pledges by other countries. So, in fact, we need to understand the challenges, the associated challenges in achieving net zero targets. So, one of the challenge is that it is about the electric vehicles. Is India ready to roll out electric vehicles at a massive scale? Secondly, the viability of renewable energy projects. Our renewable energy projects are really viable for India. So, what are the costs which are being associated with any major nuclear accidents if we completely rely on, if we mostly rely on nuclear energy? Because we have already seen Chernobyl nuclear disaster, Fukushima nuclear disaster during the 2012 tsunami in Japan. Okay, so in this context, so one aspect is the issues in smooth transition to renewables, because in order to have a renewable energy project, for example, the solar renewable energy generation project, so that requires a huge amounts of land. Okay, so identification of a land that has a high renewable energy potential, and also the time consuming procedure for land clearance, land acquisition. So this is another major challenge. So when we talk about the wind energy, the associated ecological impacts with these wind turbines should also be taken into consideration. And also, please understand, all the states uh, do not have the potential for wind energy generation. So this is the second challenge which is being associated with the renewable energies. So after that, even though we are planning to formulate electric vehicles, we still lack the relevant technology and also the skilled labor force. That is very important for the electronic vehicles manufacturing. So since we are technologically deficient, the production of electronics and also several other raw materials such as batteries, semiconductors and controls is not easy, because batteries, semiconductors and controllers form the backbone of electric vehicles. Since we do not have the relevant industries and the relevant raw material production capacities, it would be impossible for India to roll out electric vehicles at such a massive scale as we have already envisioned. So therefore, we still continues to depend on imports for the semiconductors, batteries, and other equipment. So therefore, India should become a self-reliant and self-sufficient in this respect. Now, after that, so we still lack dedicated training courses such as skill development in renewable energy, electric vehicle manufacturing, and several other areas, and that is very important. So after that, there's a lack of charging stations. If we roll out electric vehicles, that requires charging, regular charging. So charging stations are also very important. So recently, green bonds, sovereign green bonds were also introduced, and the proceeds from these green bonds will be used on infrastructure projects, particularly the renewable energy and climate friendly infrastructure projects. However, the problem with these green bonds, even though these are safe, but they give a lesser interest rate and also they are long term bonds. Therefore, investors show less interest. So, the next challenge is the developed countries. The developed countries are not ready to transfer technology and also provide financial support. So, they have to provide 100 billion of financial assistance and even technology transfer. However, they are still reluctant to provide the technology, the necessary technology and finance to these developing countries, and they're still facing the problems of rising levels of sea and submergence of the island nations in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and they have been facing increased intensity of cyclones, landslides, floods, cloudbursts, etc. So, in this respect, we need to address these challenges in order to overcome, you know, the in order to achieve the net zero targets. So, in this respect, in order to ensure effective and timely transition, so to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, if possible, 1.5 degrees Celsius mostly, but if it exceeds maximum 2 degrees Celsius. So effective and timely transition towards net zero targets, especially at the global level, uh, different nations should clearly define their net zero targets. For example, recently India has come forward. India has also clearly defined its net zero targets, how India is going to achieve its net zero targets. So India has also announced various policy measures to achieve net zero targets. So in a similar sense, different countries should come forward and they should announce their net zero targets. So along with the announcing net zero targets, they should also put in place a concerted efforts to achieve those respective targets. Okay, so it should significantly strengthen their nationally determined contributions. Okay, these countries have to uh, announce their nationally determined contributions, and those contributions should be followed in letter and spirit by these countries. So therefore, it improves the implementation of these nationally determined contributions also. And in this respect, developed nations need to provide the developing nations with requisite climate finance and also the technology, because climate finance and technology will help developing capacities among these developing countries and will also offset the negative impacts of the climate change. How? Because they develop mitigation and also adaptation capabilities. So over a period of time, these measures will ensure timely and effective transition of all nations towards their net zero targets. So this is how you can conclude this answer. So the next question is about cloudburst. So cloudburst has become a more common phenomenon, particularly in northern states. We have seen cloudbursts in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, and even the states like Kerala. So therefore, we need to understand what are cloudbursts. So why and how these cloudbursts actually occur. So what are the consequences of cloudbursts? And therefore, we should also suggest some measures for disaster risk reduction and management due to the cloudbursts. So this is the question. So first understand what are these cloudbursts. Okay, so a cloudburst is nothing but a localized and intense rainfall activity. So in a particular area, if you see an intense rainfall, it is considered as, it is one of the characteristics of cloudburst. So you cannot simply say that it is a cloudburst, but it is one of the important characteristic of a cloudburst. Okay, so it is a localized but intense rainfall activity. So cloudburst can be determined by a short spells of very heavy or intense rainfall over a small geographical area. So that can consequently create a widespread destruction in that particular area. So this is how the cloudburst is actually defined. So not all instances of very heavy rainfall can be categorized as cloudburst. Okay, so for example, there's a heavy rainfall, intense rainfall, so that cannot be categorized as cloudburst, but it has a certain characteristics. Heavy rainfall is one such characteristic. So in fact, cloudburst has a specific definition. So what is this definition? So according to this definition, cloudburst means rainfall of 10 centimeters or more. We know that the rainfall of in a particular area is measured in centimeters. So rainfall of 10 centimeters or more in an hour. So in a single hour, rainfall of 10 centimeters or more in roughly 10 kilometer into 10 kilometer area. So this is classified as cloudburst. So as per the above mentioned definition, so even if the particular area has seen 5 centimeters of rainfall in a period of half an hour, so that could also be categorized as cloudburst. Okay, so this is the specific definition of cloudburst. So in this respect, what are the consequences of cloudburst? Okay, so cloudburst has several consequences. So what exactly the consequences of cloudburst? Now, if you look at the origin of these cloudbursts, so they are mostly the orographic origin. Okay, orographic origin. For example, this is wind-laden site. So in this wind-laden site, so winds are generally obstructed by these mountains. So after obstruction, the wind rises over this area and it cools down, and it results in heavy rainfall or heavy precipitation of that particular area. Okay, so this is a wind-laden area and it is a shadow region. Shadow region, rainfall shadow region. So this can be observed in Western Ghats. So the western margins of Western Ghats receives heavy rainfall. On the other hand, the eastern margins are relatively dry. So that region is known as rain shadow region. So in this context, what are the consequences? So first consequence will be a landslide because they are orogenic in origin, and landslides mostly takes place at mountains. Okay, so because of heavy and intense rainfall over a particular region, particularly in the mountainous region, that could trigger landslides. Okay, so because of heavy rainfall, the movement of rocks and debris over a slope downwards is actually called as landslides. So heavy rainfall and rocks and debris moves downwards. So in fact, heavy rainfall would result in loss of human loss and also property loss. So that we have observed during the Uttarakhand cloudburst. So that has resulted in loss of thousands of lives, even thousands of people have missing. So there's a rise in death toll and also loss of property due to the heavy cloudburst. So after that, cloudburst will also result in spread of communicable diseases because it is an intense rainfall and water stagnant water will create waterborne diseases because it contaminates water, and that could result in typhoid and other associated fever. So in fact, it also results in vector-borne diseases like dengue, malaria, and it also spreads rapidly through floods because the stagnant water can become a fertile breeding ground for mosquitoes, and they can further spread to they can further spread dengue and malaria to other people. So in fact, cloudburst has also impact. It also impacts agriculture because it destroys large number of crops and impacts food security of that particular area. Now, for example, rice is being cultivated. Now, the fields of rice and wheat are being flooded by this water of a cloudburst. So therefore, it destroys large number of crops and it will also impact food security of the country. And the livestock will also get displaced, and even death of large scale mortality of the livestock also takes place because of the cloudburst. And in fact, it can disrupt communication of an area. For example, so it can damages the transportation links, railway, telephone, and other network. So in fact, bridges, rail, power plants, so that can be destroyed by these cloudbursts. So therefore, disrupting the entire communication network. So after that, economic and social disruption also is the major consequence of cloudburst because so when cloudburst takes place, we need to evacuate the people, set up relief camps, and there's a huge infrastructure losses and human losses, and post-disaster reconstruction and building of that particular area. So therefore, there will be a huge economy and social consequences because the economy will completely come to a standstill, and people will be forced to move to another place because of these disasters. Now, in this context, what are the challenges which are being associated while detecting cloudburst? So there are a number of challenges that are associated with the detection of these cloudbursts. So firstly, we have to discuss about the forecast. Now, forecasting is very important because if you are able to forecast a particular disaster, then you can give early warning to the people who are living in a vulnerable and hazardous zones so that the rescue and relief operations and even evacuation can be done at a quicker pace. So therefore, a specific cloud burst events cannot forecast at an early stage. So we cannot forecast these cloud bursts at an early stage. For example, if you look at earthquakes also cannot forecast, they cannot be forecast at an early stage. So in fact, the possibility of extreme or heavy rainfall over that particular region and that results in cloud burst can be forecast. So it can be forecasted over 6 to 12 years, 12 hours in advance. So therefore, it is a very less time for making adequate preparation, whether it is about evacuation of the people and even providing relief and rescue material to the people. Even deploying the NDRF forces is not easy, particularly in a country like India, because So they are located in remote corners, these orographic regions, the mountainous regions, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and Kerala. So therefore, deployment also is not very easy. So after that, the failure of the satellite. Now, satellite based weather forecasting is also very crucial. So that they can also accurately predict any disaster at an early stage. So, however, in fact, satellites also fail to detect the cloudburst systems because the precipitation radars in these satellites are actually much smaller than the areas of individual cloudburst events. So, in fact, if you look at the individual cloudburst events, they are located in a very narrow or a very less area, a very less region. So, therefore, the satellite radars, the precipitation radars in these satellites cannot actually predict or accurately predict the cloudburst event in a very small region. So that is the major challenge that is associated with these cloudbursts. So apart from that, higher costs which are involved with prediction and forecasting of these cloudbursts. So in fact, radars need to be installed in wide areas. So when we install radars in a wide areas, that helps in wider coverage. So, however, but installing radars in wider areas is more expensive. So, we cannot afford in installing more and more radars to predict these cloud bursts. So, this is another challenge. So, after that, there's also a technological hurdle that is being involved because it is difficult for any meteorological agency. We have Indian Meteorological Organization. Okay, so in fact, it is very difficult for any meteorological agencies to predict these cloudbursts at an advanced stage. Okay, so in which area they likely occur. So it is very difficult for these meteorological agencies. Okay, so in fact, it is difficult to predict these cloudbursts, but Doppler radars can be helpful in predicting them. So Doppler radars can be accurately predict these cloudbursts. So in fact, there is also a lack of feasibility because it requires a very dense network of weather, weather instruments and also computing capabilities. So that seems unfeasible with the current technologies. So these are the challenges which are being associated with these cloudbursts. So given here, so in a nutshell, so what is the mechanism of cloudburst? So implications, prevention and mitigation steps. Okay, so just observe this. What is a cloudburst? Cloudburst is generally defined as heavy or intense rainfall in a fragile and unstable landscape, narrow valleys, and also high slope gradient areas. So that is generally observed in mountainous regions in Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and even states like Kerala. So the location of human settlements along with the perennial rivers and seasonal streams, so they are more vulnerable to these cloudbursts. So, in fact, irrational developmental activities over human pressure on land that will further intensify the damages that are being caused by the cloudburst. In fact, there's a deforestation and climate change, so that is also a major reason for the cloudburst. So, what will be the implications of the cloudburst? So, implications which we have already discussed. Okay, so economic and social implications, landslides, and other disasters which are being associated with cloudburst. So there will be a heavy loss of life and property because of this cloudburst. So in fact, it leads to degradation of property, degradation of arable landscape, and even forest lands as well, and a huge damage to infrastructure because it destroys and damages bridges, railway networks, and other communication channels. So therefore, there will be a huge damage to the infrastructure as well. So when we talk about the prevention, so what measures, what preventive measures we need to take? So in this respect, we need to select the suitable areas for construction and settlement. So thereby we can reduce the negative consequences which are being associated with cloudburst. So after that, avoiding construction settlements in fragile slopes. For example, mountainous regions are vulnerable to cloudburst when intense rainfall taking place in these regions that could further trigger landslides. Okay, so intense movement of debris over the mountain slopes. For example, if constructions if human settlements are located below these slopes, that would lead to huge loss of lives. So therefore we need to avoid constructing settlements in fragile slopes along the streams. So the other factor is we need to impart training in rural people for minimizing damage. So community participation, community involvement, creating awareness and training among the people. So how to respond during the cloudburst like an event. And after that, as part of the mitigation, so we need to deploy trained personnel to assess the affected people. But the essence of the deployment of trained personnel lies in the quick deployment. So how quick we have responded to such disasters. So after that, proper rehabilitation of the affected areas is also very important. And prompt distribution of medical facilities and food. In fact, the focus should be on deployment of NDRF, ITBP, and state disaster response force. So these are the mechanism, implications, and prevention mitigation of cloudburst and associated disasters. So the next question is about electric vehicles. So in this context, we need to understand what are the advantages and disadvantages of electric mobility. Okay, so uh, now why countries have been emphasizing on electric mobility? Because the vehicular emissions are one of the most significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Not just greenhouse gas emissions, now cities have been facing the problem of excess pollution. For example, Indian cities like Delhi, Mumbai, so they have been facing excessive environmental pollution because of the vehicular emissions that were primarily run by fossil fuel based engines. So they emit carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and even particulate matter 2.5 and particulate matter 10. So they are the major sources of pollution in the atmosphere. So apart from that, it also results in greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions further contributing to climate change. So therefore, in order to mitigate climate change, there is a need to shift towards the electric vehicles and electronic vehicles because it is environment friendly, firstly, and countries will be able to achieve their net intended nationally determined contributions and will also achieve their net zero targets. So because of this reason, countries are being emphasizing on the electric mobility. So in this context, we need to understand what are the advantages and disadvantages of electric mobility, and we have to discuss the significance and barriers to National Mission for Electric Mobility. So National Mission for Electric Mobility that was launched by the government. So in this context, we need to understand the significance and barriers of national mobility, national policy on electric mobility. So in fact, there is a significant rise in production and sales of electric vehicles in India. Okay, not just in India, but in other countries also. Many countries have been emphasizing on production and sales of these electric vehicles. So the automobile manufacturers have focused on investing heavily in the electric vehicle technologies because the EV technologies are the future. Now, in fact, fossil fuel based vehicles fleet, the countries have also been imposing restrictions on these fossil fuel based vehicles. So, therefore, EV is the future, and these manufacturing companies have also been heavily investing in these EV technologies. has resulted in launching electric models. So a wide variety of electric models so that can meet the growing demand in the different parts of the world. So in fact, increased availability and diversity of these electric vehicles have been contributing to the era of EVs. Okay, so the era of EV electronic vehicles is actually underway, and the increased and diversified fleet of these electronic vehicle models have been contributing to the era of electronic vehicles. So in this context, in past few years, there were several advancements that were being made in battery technology and also the infrastructure development with respect to electric vehicles. So these aspects have played a very crucial role in accelerating adoption to electronic vehicles. Even if you look at India, it has launched a program called FAME, Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Electric Vehicles. So in this context, the development of more efficient and affordable batteries has extended the driving range of electric vehicles, and it has also reduced the anxiety among the consumers because the technology has already making a rapid advancements, and customized electronic vehicle technologies are being provided to the customers, and because a wider participation of the automobile companies has also resulted in increased competition and better affordability. So in fact, additionally, expansion of the charging infrastructure and the public charging stations and home charging solutions. So all these factors have improved the overall convenience and accessibility to these electronic vehicles. So in fact, governments and policymakers across the world have showing a strong commitment and strong will in promoting electric vehicles and as a means to address climate change and also reducing emissions. So this is the importance of rolling out electronic vehicles and how electric vehicles are the future. So the government and the private sector have showing a renewed focus on these electric vehicles. Now in this context, we need to understand what are the benefits, advantages and disadvantages of these electric vehicles. So firstly, if you look at pros, uh, it is being energy efficient. Electric vehicles, they actually convert a higher percentage of energy to power without any loss. So there will be a less energy losses with respect to these electric vehicles. Secondly, electric vehicles run on electricity without producing any carbon emissions. So they never produce any carbon emissions. So they just release, water. That's it, and water vapor. So they help to reduce the environmental pollution also. So the source of environmental pollution and greenhouse gases is transportation sector itself. So therefore, it helps in reducing these emissions as well. So in fact, the electric vehicles are cost effective in the long term. So in the short term, they may be costly, but in the long term, because of development of technologies and advancements in battery technologies, so they can become a cost effective in the long term. So in fact, EV charging has also become cheaper compared to the conventional fossil fuels. So the government of India has offering several incentives for the purchase of these electric vehicles. For example, cost, GST reduction, and reduced loan interest rates, so that all these factors can make electric vehicles more affordable for the consumers. So what are the other advantages of these electric vehicles? So electric vehicles can operate very quickly. So uh, you know uh, you have already seen several electric vehicles. So compared to the conventional vehicles which run on fossil fuels, the engines of these electric vehicles reduce, they work with less noise, or without any engine noise. So therefore, they will also substantially reduce the noise pollution as well. So electric vehicles enhance the energy independence of India and reducing import fuels. So in fact, if you look at India's fossil fuel imports, 85% of total energy requirements are met through imports. So electric vehicles substantially reduce India's dependence on these imports. And as we have already discussed, they do not produce any emissions. And in fact, they help in improving air quality and will also reduce various potential health risks, asthma and bronchitis. So R&D and innovation of electric vehicles are enhancing the overall automotive and related sectors such as renewable energy and also energy storage. So these are the advantages and benefits of the electric vehicles. So what are the disadvantages? So the disadvantages is in the long run, so they are more cost effective. But what about the short term? In the short run, so initial cost of buying these electric vehicles is very high. Okay, for example, a country like India, which has been importing uh, batteries, EV batteries, and we are using high-end technologies. So that has been making the electric vehicle cost is much more higher. So in fact, we are having an underdeveloped charging infrastructure. So okay, we are rolling out electric vehicles, but what about the charging infrastructure? So that is also very important. So number of EV charging stations in India are comparatively low. So therefore, we should focus on these charging stations. Apart from that, the most affordable electric cars in India come with small battery capacities. So small battery capacities, so they have to be more frequently charged. So they should run at just 100 to 200 kilometers, which is quite low. So apart from that, the time required to charge an electric vehicle is very high. So very high time so required to charge these electric vehicles. So that creates problem for sectors such as ride hailing and last mile deliveries. So the other disadvantages with these electric mobility is limited electric vehicle models. For example, if you look at the hybrid, not just hybrid but fossil fuel run based vehicles, fossil fuel based vehicles, there are a wide variety of models which are being available. So therefore, it creates a challenges for the buyers to find electric vehicles that actually meet their specific requirements, preferences, and budget. And there are several older electric vehicle models also. So these EV models have underdeveloped technologies. So these underdeveloped technologies lowers their resale value in the current time. So even though they are electric vehicles. So apart from that, EV charging during peak hours create a lot of pressure on the grids because all the vehicles have to be charged. So during peak hours, for example, during daytime, what happens that it creates a lot of pressure on energy grids. So that results in power outages and lower charging efficiency of these vehicles. So that impacts overall transportation sector. So the replacement cost of an electric vehicle battery once it completes cycle is very high. For example, every battery has a particular cycle. Now, if it completes the cycle of a battery, we need to replace it with another battery, but the cost is very high. The battery cost is very high, and that is another major challenge. So, the question has also asked about the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan 2020. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of this National Electric Mobility Mission Plan? So, this program was launched in the year 2020. National Electric Mobility Mission Plan was launched. So, what are the objectives of the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan? So, in order to ensure national energy security and mitigation of adverse impact of vehicles on the environment, because we have already discussed that these vehicles which are run on the fossil fuels, they have adverse environmental impact, whether it is emission of greenhouse gases and emission of pollutants. So the electric mobility has also focused on further strengthening the domestic manufacturing capabilities. So we have already announced FAME program, faster adoption and manufacturing of electric vehicles. So this will give a further fillip to the program. So National Electric Mobility and Mission Plan is one of the most important interventions of the government. Okay, so what is the aim of the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan? So it will transform the automotive paradigm of future by lessening the dependence on fossil fuels. So because we have been depending on fossil fuel imports So 85% of our fossil fuels are being imported. So the National Electric Mobility Plan will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and it also increases the energy efficiency of the vehicles. So whatever vehicles we have, so the energy dependency of these vehicles, you know, the energy efficiency of these vehicles will be significantly increased, and so it will result in cleaner transportation. So this is compatible with sustainable renewable energy generation. Okay, so in fact, this particular intervention, the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan 2020, will encourage Indian automotive industry to shift to newer, cleaner technologies. Okay, so as of now, they are producing hybrid engines, fossil fuel-based engines. They have not changed the technologies, but now they will change the technologies, transform these electric models, and also offer better models for the consumers, and they shift to newer and cleaner technologies so that it builds future it builds its future competitive advantage, and it is environmentally sustainable also, and high-end technologies development, innovation, and knowledge takes place. So this is the overall objective benefits of National Electric Mobility Mission Plan. So however, when we talk about the disadvantages of this particular program, so it requires huge investments from not just from the private sector but also from the public sector. According to an estimate, it requires around 11 lakh crore rupees. Secondly, the private companies are not ready to roll out electric vehicles on a large scale. So this is another major challenge. So after that, what about the electric charging infrastructure? So that is also very important if you are rolling out electric mobility, or if you're focusing on electric mobility, electric charging stations is also very crucial. However, it has not created any special authority which actually looks into the electric mobility mission plan, and it has also have no clarity on state's role with respect to the electric mobility, and along with demarcating the roles and responsibilities between the state and central government and even the private sector, it is largely silent on the objectives, the guidelines which have to be provided to the private sector. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan. So finally, you have to just emphasize on National Electric Mobility Mission Plan is a welcome initiative by the government, because it results in India achieving its targets, and it is environment friendly also. But the challenges and the disadvantages have to be taken care of. So in this way, you can conclude this answer. Okay, so that's it for today, and in tomorrow's lecture also we will discuss few questions. So if you like the video, subscribe to our channel.